Okay, I think we're about good to go. So hello, everybody. My name is Ruth Launer. I'm the Network Manager for the Digital Good Network. Thank you so much for joining us today for the third in a series of 4 webinars to disseminate some of the findings from the Public Voices in AI project. And today's webinar is Lessons from a Deliberative Inquiry, a Framework and Self-Assessment Toolkit. And we're delighted to be joined today by Ellie O'Keefe from the Ada Lovelace Institute and Reema Patel from Elgon Social, who will be joining us very shortly. So before I hand over to Ellie, I'll just give a bit of an overview of the project. So Ellie, if you want to go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I just wanted to start off with a bit of a very brief intro to the project and why we think it's so important to include public voices in AI, which is really the heart of the year-long project that we carried out. First of all, it's to realise the opportunities of AI. We're very much keen to help secure social contract for investment in AI as well. We want to empower policymakers to produce good AI policy and to empower developers to build the AI-enabled society that people want. And we want to make sure that everyone's voices are represented, not just the small minority. We also want to fill the public voice gap in existing conversations and to bridge gaps that can be caused by unequal AI impacts and different capacities to influence AI systems. And so that's a very brief introduction to the project and why we thought it was so important. And if we can have the next slide, please, Ellie. And here are some of the logos of the institutions that were involved in this year-long project. Some of these were the people that were conducting the research, and some of the logos at the bottom are some of the people who we funded through the project to do some additional research projects for us. So we reviewed 320 pieces of evidence, surveyed over 4,000 AI researchers. We produced lots of resources and outputs, and when I hand over to Ellie, I'll pop a link in the chat where you can see all the outputs from the project. There's an impressive amount that we managed to get through in a year, so we hope you spend some time looking through those. We conducted a national survey of over 3,500 people, but we also worked with community researchers, so we really wanted to make sure that we were getting lots and lots of voices involved in this project. So to hand over to today's topic, I will hand over to Ellie O'Keefe. Thanks very much, Ellie, and we'll look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much, Ruth. Hi, everyone. Just to say that I can't quite see things like the chat or anything like that and everything, but any kind of questions or responses that you have, we look forward to hearing them at the end of the presentation, and they will come up via Ruth. So that's brilliant. Thank you, Ruth. What I'm going to do is talk you through the process, a little bit of the process and the findings of this project that we did. So Reema's work that she's going to talk about later is really a framework for how to involve publics in questions about AI. And this is perhaps an empirical example of when somebody or an organisation has tried to involve publics and engage them on questions about AI. So this is a bit about what we found through this process and a bit of our learning from that. And as much as possible, I'll try and link to some of the broader observations and findings that Reema has pulled out in the framework too, to put these into a bit of a relationship. So we focused, just a little bit of background, we focused on public good. So how do diverse people in different places think about AI for the public good? This was for many different reasons. A really good one was that public good was appearing a lot in rhetorics and justifications for AI investment in policy and tech innovation. And it was not often, which is a kind of age-old problem, very clear about what that really meant, what good looks like, and what actually publics feel about what good looks like. So we wanted to start from the basis of what publics believe in, is public good for AI, and to really try to focus on that public perspective and encourage as much as we could publics to set the agenda, to talk about things that really, really matter to them, and to actually feed in as much as possible to that question of AI and the public good. And we could have chosen many different routes to do that. There are lots of different participatory forms of research that we could have chosen, but we really tried to ground this as much as we could in community-led research methods and embedding, which is really embedding research in the lives of communities as much as possible. And you'll see here in the slide that we've acknowledge the work of the community researchers who worked with us. We had a pair of community researchers in each of our research locations, and they were fundamental to the project at all stages, which I'll talk through in a second. So we work with community researchers in 3 different places: Belfast, Brixton, and Southampton. Happy to talk a little bit more later about why those sites were chosen and what processes we went through to get there. But broadly, this was bringing together community-led research methods with deliberative methods to bring some kind of structure to the process of helping people understand the core debates or core critical areas and tensions about AI use and its benefits for the public good, but also trying to get a sort of post-qualitative element of surprise to really try to see if we could encourage them to set the agendas as much as we could. So we did this in different ways. So there is a structured process that we went through, and that included co-designing the activities with the researchers themselves. But we also took them through a series of structured learning events that happened online. And these were all running in parallel. I should have said all the 3 locations. They came together in the learning sessions for the first time. The learning sessions we designed in partnership with We and AI, and we particularly really lent on their notion of critical AI literacy to help people build an understanding of the core issues that AI might present to them, as well as the benefits. And before we started on that journey, we had an exploration of what public good meant to them. So we could start from that basis in the first instance. And afterwards, stage number 3, we came back together with them, led by the community researchers, to look at what happened now to their public good in the light of AI and where those things could fit together or not for them. At the end of the process, we brought community researchers into the co-analysis, and they also fed into the insights as the report was being written. A little bit about the people involved. We had 15 to 17 people in each of the sites, and we used a self-identification measure of exclusion to operate the recruitment process. I could talk for hours about this recruitment process in and of itself. It raised all sorts of fascinating discussions with the community researchers about issues of power and participation. But many of the people who ended up engaging with us were people who had suffered various forms of different discrimination or exclusion. People were struggling to find work, people who had caring responsibilities, and often people who were excluded due to citizenship. So, for instance, our Belfast cohort included about half who had either been through the process of resettlement or were currently going through an application for settlement in the UK from places across the world. So, what did we find? There are, I'm trying to give you a top level response on this as much as I can. There's obviously more detail in the report. I highly encourage you to read it. But yes, these are the kind of core things that we found about how diverse publics thought about public good. There were lots of differences. There was a huge amount of diversity, but there were some common threads that we could pull across each of the cohorts and within the cohorts themselves. And one of them is looking at how people responded to public good as a very values-based concept, particularly centralizing notions of equity and fairness. That was really important to people. And that community was really important too, and foundational. These relationships really mattered to them for achieving a public good for everybody. And they explored what public good meant for them in the everyday, but that also meant clean air, green spaces, and a sense of security and well-being, which they got through the kind of community basis, the community relationships, and security in income. Nature and access to nature came up again and again. It was a very common theme. So when policymakers think about or talk about public good in relation to AI, they really have to think about what people are reading through those words. Ours is one study, of course, but it chimes with many others that have looked at good society and what's good for people in different ways. It was a really meaningful values-based concept for people, even if they couldn't quite agree on some of the details or the tonalities. So how do they make sense of AI in that information journey that we took them on? Obviously, a lot of them had come across AI in very different ways. Some of them are quite using AI already in their work or their leisure lives or their family lives, and others were quite hesitant or hadn't engaged with it at all. What struck us about their readings of technology of our participants, they really read the technology ecosystem very well. Their views were perceptive and sophisticated about what kinds of shifts they were living through. So people understood that AI in a particular context might have benefits or risks for some people. And they also understood that AI creates a sort of system and a societal level change, and it relies on infrastructures. And that also can change society in indirect ways. They see that novel AI development is rapidly changing the ground for conversation about whether AI could work for them. So a lot of their views were predicated on a sense of uncertainty and the constant expectation of change. And their views, therefore, were composite because of it. They hold many different views or sometimes quite contradictory views at once. And it was quite interesting for us then because we could see and dig into, in a way that we couldn't do for our national survey, some of the nuances and assumptions that underpin some what are considered to be quite core accepted beliefs about AI now in society. A really good example of that in our study is if you look in the report, there is a section on facial recognition technologies in policing, which our survey says the public believe largely is very beneficial. And when we dug into it a little bit in our Belfast context, you can really see that the questions and caveats that come along with thinking about those technologies with regard to place. And what we're seeing from all of this is that people are expecting big changes, but they're not quite sure what they mean for them because AI could be used in all sorts of different ways. So at the end, we came to put those two things together, so public good and AI. And we found a lot of excitement in some ways. There was a really, really positive response to the idea that AI might be able to solve big human level challenges. So climate change or diagnosing cancer at an earlier stage, they're very, very warm to these ideas. Also to the potential for AI to rebalance power dynamics in their favor, which they obviously felt was quite exciting. So there was kind of a set of enthusiasms, but that came with quite clear boundaries about the impacts or the wider impacts of AI and their abilities to live meaningful or purposeful lives. And there were very clear red lines for people about, any idea that AI might further inequalities and might further discriminate vulnerable groups. People felt was a red line for them. And this included the use of AI in public services too, and vital public services. So for instance, one of the participants who was going through the settlement process was really spoke very movingly about his worries about AI use in that process, because he felt that what people needed was actually more empathy and more human connection and human level decision making, not reliance on machine tools. So I'm going to, these are a set of expectations. The process wasn't long or structured enough to produce a clear set of recommendations that were firmly tied to policy agendas. There's also a question of what those emerging policy agendas would be as well. So it's hard to pin down some very clear questions or trade-offs to involve publics on. But we did ask them to cohere a set of expectations for how they believe AI should work in public good, which you can dig into further in the report. But I wanted to kind of sum up a little bit about how people responded generally. And I think one of the kind of core things that we found was that people's responses were very situated in their existing experiences of poorly conceived digital services, for instance, that have been used in underfunded public services. They really, they reflected the feeling that they were, that the systems or services that they relied on were already uncaring enough, and the worries that they would increase that. They reflected worries of the hype of market-driven tech and social media, which they felt was already fragmenting their social relationships, and AI would only make that worse. So there's a lot of curiosity and there was interest, but there was also a set of concerns. So what I'm going to do before I hand over to Reema is to try to kind of put some reflections in about what that tells us about what the experience told me and Ada about some of the ways in which we can bring publics together to inform AI decision-making or systems. So for us, I think the community-led translation of this project was really, really key. So the community's researchers' abilities to both talk to people in ways that they understood and relate AI to questions that were relevant to them. That really mattered at all stages of the project, from the big workshops to the online. You know, our community researchers were with people in the online groups, in the breakout rooms, and that mattered too. But also, you know, they helped each other in each of these cohorts to translate it for themselves. And that was really key for developing a sort of shared set of understandings about what AI meant. And I think for us, it allowed us to see very different, AI manifested very different sets of conversations and debates in different places. It wasn't the same. There were some commonalities and some shared priorities, but these places reflected the distinctness of their own political cultures and capacities. And so that was like, that was quite good for us to kind of, to start thinking about that and point to. And for us, it opened windows into thinking about what a place-based deliberative system can, you know, how that can inform and strengthen people's involvement and engagement with these issues. A lot of our community researchers had networks that they drew on. They were thinking ahead to think about how they can engage their societies further in these questions. And you could see that these sort of little ecosystems were emerging from these relationships. And for us, it was quite striking, partly because too, a lot of the two of our sites, our research sites at Belfast and Southampton, are very, very closely drawn into the AI funding ecosystem. And actually that was the community researchers' adjacency to that was quite important to getting them involved in the first place. So you sort of see these hotspots. I guess the question next is how to take these hotspots across the country. The other thing that we found, which I think relates to Reema's work, which I'm trying to bring out here, is that the deficit model that Reema describes so well in her framework and report, resisting that as part of deliberative work is really challenging. I think there is a sort of weight of deliberation where it's sort of trying to normalize, you know, the arguments and the information and get people on board, that kind of liberalizing process anyway. As practitioners, we were trying to resist that at all stages, but it was really difficult. And I think I was reflecting on why this was the case. And it wasn't just about choices that we made in the design. It was about the participants themselves. So if we think about the deficit model in its hierarchies, where information specialists are placed at the top, which Reema described so nicely, this is something that participants have internalized themselves. So we found that a lot of people who did well from their AI technical adoption and really wanted other people to do well too, had started to think of these information hierarchies in very similar ways. So they saw other people's concerns about, being about ignorance. They felt that other people, if they knew more about AI like they did, they might, therefore understand the benefits of it. And we started to see that these big narratives, I think, are interweaving into people's subjectivities and their understanding of themselves and their own capacities in really, really quite challenging ways. Anyway, I'm going to leave that conversation. We'd love to know more if you have any questions from you, for us rather, about where we could go next with this research, or any questions you have. I'd love to hear them. But I think it's now time to hand over to Reema, who will be talking about the framework.
Okay, thank you so much. And what a way to begin a discussion about this, because actually Ellie's left off exactly where this framework starts, which is an analysis of some of the challenges with the more sort of traditional, conventional way when we're thinking about shaping the direction of travel of AI. So when we're thinking about traditional policy, research culture, the types of knowledges that they prioritize and value often doesn't make space for the lived experience of communities, people. And it's really interesting because this challenge that Ellie has been speaking about is a challenge which is how do we then ensure that the participatory processes that happen on AI don't themselves replicate or reinforce these deficit models or these asymmetries of information and power structure. And I've actually just come from a series of discussions about this in relation to food policy at an international level. So one of the things that we're really thinking about is how you even frame knowledge systems themselves, the whose knowledge and what kinds of knowledge, in addition to technical, economic, social science, needs to be acknowledged as bringing expertise, certainly the knowledge of the people who are shaping AI, but also other types of knowledge about historical or colonial power structures, knowledge about indigenous perspectives that may have been marginalized or excluded. So this framework really speaks to these sort of structural challenges and how participation can be a mechanism for inclusion as well as just participation. So that's a really important framing piece. Next slide. And I'm not sure whether I can. Oh, I can move the slides. Brilliant. So the framework is introduced, but so there's also a self-assessment workbook for including public voices in AI, which is a much more practical set of tools that supports that and comes from the framework and the theoretical analysis here. In terms of the sort of ways of thinking about this, and next slide. The framework sets out a way of thinking about engagement on AI that moves from inform, consult, up to involve, collaborate, and empower. So it shifts from no power through to low power, which is just simply telling people what they should think about AI, all the way up to a much more collaborative relationship between technical specialists, members of the public, civil society, all the way up through to empower. And something really interesting here is that when I was looking at case studies, very few case studies and initiatives have actually succeeded in just giving people control over the way AI tools and technologies work. This framework comes from Sherry Arnstein's work on a ladder of citizen participation. And in this framework, she argues that we need to move beyond this deficit model towards a model that activates people's sense of critical agency and sense of agency and control over these technology. And so she distinguishes what she calls tokenism, simply telling people about AI technologies, from these much more collaborative spaces in which people can shape and have and exercise agency over the direction of travel of certain policy areas. And she was writing not about AI, but about health. And so this framework talks about how we can apply this way of thinking to AI technologies going forward. Next slide. This is really sort of set out in this key illustration where she talks about no power. So she uses the sort of sense of manipulation as a kind of a status quo, or a space in which AI tools and technology, by way of example, might be done to people. So they're being used or they're being deployed in lots of different ways to shape how people behave and how people act with limited knowledge and awareness of those tools and technology. And that's an interesting challenge that certainly we're observing this sort of context of manipulation. She slightly more controversially also talks about therapy here. So, I mean, that's the sort of 1970s context in which she was writing and working. Then she described this challenge of low power. So there's sort of almost tokenism. So this sort of sense that members of the public are these sort of empty vessels that must be filled and placated. And so we must tell them how we're using AI tools and technology, but it's not really much of a sense of activating their sense of agency or critical literacy or sense of ability to do something about AI tools and technology. And then no, she does take a quite critical approach to traditional forms of statutory consultation in terms of that approach as well. And in this paper, there's a real vision for what she describes as high power or increasing degrees of citizen power. So a world in which there's more of a partnership between, say, developers, policymakers, and members of the public, more of a sense of distributed sense of power. So more space and opportunity for people to actually change outcomes or direct or advise or recommend what outcomes should look like. And then ultimately citizen control. And of course, I have not yet seen any really obvious examples of where citizens have control over AI decision-making processes, but she does allude to that being the end goal or the vision. So the framework speaks to all of that. Next slide. Now, the framework also sort of talks about how AI is embedded across society, operating within planetary boundaries, but also within the context of society as a whole. So when we're talking about inclusion and participation, that shaped AI in lots of different ways, but really what we're really talking about is in participation, inclusion that shapes society, and some of the key tensions and the trade-offs and the dynamics between our environment, our planetary boundaries, and the needs of society in the short term, medium term, but also in the long term. And then also at a sort of much more granular level, these conversations about AI are actually about how organizations themselves are structured, how they interact with some of the physical systems that underpin AI, how they interact with people, people's relationships with each other, and also activities or tasks that might happen at a localized level, whether that's in the home or in the workplace. So people can participate in lots of different ways in shaping AI, but also shaping societal questions as well. So they can participate upstream in shaping the data that trains the AI models, decision-making, questions around cost, benefits, whether AI tools and technologies will work, tensions and trade-offs and other goals that society might be wanting to realize, such as, climate justice, net zero goal, equity, and ensuring that everyone has the chance to have a say. They can also participate midstream. So in lots of different ways, the AI development process is not that streamlined or clear, but there are definitely points across the AI lifecycle where members of the public might be able to shape the models that are being deployed or developed. There are certainly points at which members might want to understand how the AI models are themselves working, sort of moving away from what I would like to call a black box approach to development towards what I like to call a glass box approach to development. And then there's also, I call this downstream, actually it's not really downstream, because obviously AI as embedded in society means that we need to sort of think about how AI is always interacting with society and therefore its impact. So there's a downstream question, which is about the role of participation and inclusion in ensuring that AI is actually realizing its intended goal, is not creating disproportionate harms, burdens, risk for people. And this is about in understanding, addressing impacts of AI use in lots of different contexts or settings. Next slide. And what I would sort of say is that this diagram illustrates that the path to participation AI really doesn't run that smoothly, and there are lots of barriers that mean that people struggle to ensure that in commercial development or in policy development or in regulation development, people are included. And some of these barriers are here, kind of, listed here. Some of these are regulatory frameworks, competing incentives, including commercial incentives, the readiness of society and markets as a whole to accept the that, public views matter. Sometimes media operates and pushes a faster timeline for decision making than public participation may necessarily allow. Cultural norms, what forms of knowledge we value, for instance, and procurement processes and systems. These are all pushing back always against participatory and inclusive innovation. And so here you've got the sort of pushback from the system. And so the key question is, if we want to include people in shaping AI, we really need to think about how we overcome that big block in the middle and move towards scaling and systems change. Next slide. And so in terms of the sort of the way this challenge has been set up, is one of the big barriers for policymakers, AI developers, is lack of access to tools and resources to enable them to really think about how they are including people in AI design, implementation, and development. And so as part of this program of work, I've developed a self-assessment workbook. It's a really practical tool that allows anyone to think about how they might self-assess against some of these core values. So these core values and principles and dimensions come from an assessment and a review of prior literature on what works in shaping participatory mechanisms and processes. And there's 3 core strands. At the very heart, it's very much about the values of the inclusion or the participation process. But then there's also doing or running the participation process effectively and well. And on the left-hand side, the responsiveness of a process is also really important. There's no point in having a great engagement process with really good values to high quality if the organisation running the participatory process is not able to respond to it, or is not able to make change happen off the back of it. So in some instances, that might be important because not every participation designer or developer might be a power holding organisation. But so what really matters is the ability to activate change. So I will work through these different dimensions now to introduce the framework. Next slide. So at the very heart, we're talking about the values of the engagement process. So this workbook talks about the importance of identifying who is impacted and who is not impacted, who might be impacted, but is not necessarily a data or an AI subject. And these are all really important things to think about and consider. It also talks about the importance of understanding that people might be coming from really different standpoints with cultural norms, different religious norms and expectations, and ethical norms and expectations, and really taking account of that in developing AI tools and systems. It takes account of the fact that many people may need support in order to be able to shape outcomes. So thinking about what practically that might look like. It could be safeguarding, could be about digital onboarding, it could be about remuneration or childcare, these sorts of things. Then there's something about so Ellie was talking about the relational elements. So what's the relationship being established here? What do people get out of being able to shape this? What's the benefit and the return back to them? So this ethics of care and mutuality towards communities and citizens is also really important. And then we also talk about, and we're thinking about the independence and the trustworthiness of the process. So actually, when including people, what's the role for a really independent voice that is equipped to sort of say, this is what people said they wanted. That basically no cherry picking is sort of the summary of that point. Next slide. So another series of dimensions relates to actually doing deliberation and participation and inclusion well. So there are some core fundamentals here. One's around public gallery, accountability and transparency. If you involved members of the public in your AI tool or technology, would we know about that? And would we know what people said about that? That seems to be a fairly fundamental point. Proportionate time, resources, and support for inclusion. So here, actually, sort of ensuring that there's enough space, physically and literally, for that inclusion to happen. And often, what we find with the sort of slightly more tokenistic or tick box type exercises is that they happen so late that there's not enough time for that involvement or adequate support for involvement. And then there's a sort of a commitment to the quality assurance. Actually, a lot of really good deliberative or participatory processes have an evaluation lined up, or a way of just understanding how that participatory process is working or operating. On the next slide, relates to the responsiveness of the process, and that point about making change happen or being able to enable change to happen is really important. And here it's understanding who is actually stewarding or owning this process, and what is their responsibility and what is their role, and then also who gets to shape the agenda. Is there space for agenda setting, for identifying the priorities, for shaping that outcome? That's a really important question. It seems so obvious that we should, but I sort of wanted to mention it, which is, do we actually know what we're involving people on? The clarity about the use case, the context, and the strategy. What is it that they are feeding into? These are all really important points. Sometimes you do see these sort of rather high-level AI participatory processes, but it's not really that clear exactly what issue or application is being kind of deliberated about. And related to that, clarity of purpose and scope. So what's within scope and what's out of scope is really important. And then the responsiveness and or commitment to act. And as I've already mentioned, that might look really different depending on the type of organization that is convening or stewarding this approach. So that's everything from me. It's a lot of detail there, but unfortunately the workbook is itself pretty detailed. So do take a look at it online, and do feel free to use it in any way, shape or form. Next slide. That's everything for me. And if you would like more, or even a copy posted to you, do get in touch. We can make sure that you have access to a hard copy if you like. Thank you very much. And hi, welcome back, Ellie. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Yes, good, thanks.
Great. So we've got a bit of a chance to have Q&A, and there's just any kind of key questions. And feel free to drop that in the chat, or indeed indicate what, any questions that you wanted to ask about any of this work. Ellie and I are on hand to respond to them.
I'm seeing one comment, one question in the Q&A for Reema. It's from Tanya. Lovely framework and focus on structure and relationships in general. One question is whether you had any reservations over the use of the word empower, and if so, what swayed you to keep it?
That's such a good question. So what swayed me to keep it? I mean, I have heard lots of different framings and terms, right? I've heard agency, critical thinking, there's quite a lot of different frames or lenses. I mean, what encouraged me to keep it in part was reading Ansli's work. I think that's what she's interested in. And I think that if I'm going to be working off the foundations of someone's work, someone very thoughtful about power structures, and indeed themselves embedded within power structures. So important context is that she wasn't just an academic, she was also a policymaker working in the health policy landscape in the USA. She very deliberately selected that term. Now, I think that was a conscious decision, because a lot of policymakers find that it is a kind of challenging term. The idea is really, I think she was trying to analyze and diagnose the system from within. and consciously uses this term in order to really focus our attention on the fact that power structures are less than ideal. So if we sort of take power out of the conversation, then it really becomes a rather sanitized discussion about, maybe, reinforcing the asymmetries of power that we're really talking about, trying to unpick and unpack. And I think there's a time and a space for talking about these other things like agency and critical literacy and critical thinking. But in terms of what this framework is about, it is about power. It is about the strong asymmetries of power that we're now seeing between technology companies, business models. And I think we would struggle to meaningfully articulate why participation matters without some use of the power word. But please feel very free to push back. And I don't know whether Ellie's got a different view on this. What's your view, Ellie?
On whether empowerment in and of itself just simply, reinforces existing power structures. It's Thursday afternoon, Reema. This is I feel like that we had kind of, I guess, comparable conversations, I think, with community researchers about not necessarily, I think, about around power and questions of whether because we didn't really talk about our work as being empowering in that respect with our participants, although we did talk about to and with participants about how they thought about these kinds of exercises. They themselves were using language of power, talking about power imbalances, mainly wanting people to cede power and to share, to give, rather than necessarily talking about themselves either being empowered by these kind of events or wanting to be empowered through these events. So yeah, there were some kind of discussions about kind of point and purpose about these activities as well, which I think our kind of research couldn't necessarily we couldn't necessarily resolve those questions within the frame of what we were doing, but we had to invite them into the space at the same time. And
just to sort of build off that conversation, it's really interesting because there is a view out there that the participation exercises should only be run by the people who have the power, like policymakers or regulators, or I guess in some instances tech companies. You might have that view. Unsurprisingly, having often stewarded processes like this where that have not been a policymaker or regulator or anything like that, I kind of respectfully disagree with that position. And one of the reasons that I disagree is because I think that organizations can still have the ability to make change happen on behalf of communities or different groups, because they can think about models of change, theories of change. They can activate action at like a community level, or think about their role in making systems change happen. And there's a sort of something inherently disempowering about thinking that you rely on policy structures or technology companies, for instance, to make the change that you want to see happen. Now, of course, I think that there is a role for these organizations in engaging with members of the public. That's not what I'm disagreeing with. And what I'm disagreeing is that that's the only role. And so there's really, really interesting question about the role of organizations and institutions like the Lovelace Institute, who take this sort of inside-outsider kind of positioning in the landscape, and their ability to work with and build bridges between different communities of interest. And certainly that's always interested me. So it was just a kind of reflection on some of the things that you were saying earlier there.
I know, I agree. It's kind of really That really makes a lot of sense. And I think it really ties into the question, though, which is a thorny question for us about kind of the responsibilities that we have after this kind of research and where we take it next. So somebody, I'm just going literally on order of questions over on in the Q&A. This somebody has posted, will there be an opportunity to get feedback on the workbook actions, framework ideas from the communities that Ellie worked with? Which obviously is a fascinating question and would be a fascinating set of propositions. Just to explain, one reason why these two projects didn't enter a very kind of intimate dialogue is because we were running at the same time. I think, and also the public good kind of deliberative activity came in quite late in the programme schedule for the PVAI. So there is a timescales issue, I think, partly that has to be thrown into that mix. But we've been talking a lot internally about where we take this research that we did and the relationships that we've built with community researchers and where they go next. And for us, it's difficult not to feel that there is a set of responsibilities here for organisations, that once you build these relationships, you have a set of responsibilities to navigate them to an end, if they are ending, or to take them to a next step, and to really clearly demarcate that process for people so they understand, where the journey that you're taking them on, and the thing that they're a part of, and what they do contribute to, and what's next, steps for them and for you. I'm not sure we totally resolved that in the project that we did, and we really wanted to focus much more on how, where we can also signpost people. So, for instance, the Ada Lovelace Institute, we're not an advocacy organisation. We can't get involved in questions of labour power worker organisation, but some of the things that they raised, or some of the propositions that they had from this project, might have taken them there. So, providing some signposts towards those processes was something that we kind of really felt that we should do. But at the same time, where is our research next? We are planning dissemination activities with our researchers, and that could be a place certainly where the framework enters dialogue with the local community, because these will be community grounded and community based events. So there will be kind of opportunities for some correspondence there between Reema's framework, the findings of the public good projects, and what happens next in the communities themselves, because we're really trying to help them make the next step for themselves, rather than centralising us and our research in that process. Sorry, did you want to just open one up?
It's just there was a rather rushed co-design and iterative design process for the development of the framework, mostly with basically practitioners and AI developers, and we did have a people's panel on AI, which helped shape and steward and feed into some of this, which I think, some of you may have attended a webinar about that people's panel, but just in case you didn't attend that webinar, that was a really helpful series of conversations that fed into the development of the workbook and the framework as well. And just in terms of sort of sense checking whether it actually landed with members of the public. So that's quite that, just to respond to that question, I think that's separate to the question of usability and iteration over time. And obviously, so this was just published a couple of months ago, so very, very quickly answer the question that was presented by an anonymous attendee. Have many people used the framework? Yeah, actually a few people have in a very short period of time. So obviously I have a better answer to that in probably a year's time than right now. I have been using it, and in a way, I wanted to develop something that I would have felt comfortable using myself, as someone that designs and develops and iterates participation processes, working in partnership with organisations. So in a way, it was a slight response to a need that I felt I had, and I assumed that other people had. There's no sort of suggestion that this is the last and final version or the copy, and I'd be really open to sort of working with organisations to, maybe test it, trial it, work with it in particular use cases and contexts, or further partnerships off the back of it. So yeah, if you're interested, again, do reach out.
I'm going to carry on down the list as much as we can. I think this one is for me. I was wondering about the sample of the people you talked to, and also how did you overcome language barriers, or was it strictly in English? This was a really, really difficult one. In terms of the sample, so each community researcher co-designed their recruitment strategy, and we had some principles that we put in place in co-design, including fairness and equity and inclusion. I think during the process, there's so much complexity and nuance to this, because they also all chose different recruitment strategies. So we had a sort of very different recruitment base. The area where language came up the most was Belfast, because the community researchers found considerable enthusiasm from the voluntary networks that have grown up in and around migrancy in Northern Ireland. The resettlement program there is quite significant now. So there was a lot of enthusiasm and interest from those voluntary networks, and a lot of people who applied to our project through those. And with that came a question of language barriers. We've tried to find all sorts of different ways to resolve those language barriers for people who couldn't speak English at all. And that included the community researchers looking, trying to find translators, trying to, formalize some form of language support. For the project's timescales, and this was a big compromise we made, that wasn't possible. There wasn't enough time and there wasn't enough resource to create a formal process. But what they did do, because they were, responding to very particular circumstances, was that they made sure that the people who were involved had either support from others in the room, so people that they knew who could speak English better, perhaps, and they made sure that they spent more time with them, helping them sort of think through some of the more complex language type issues for English as a second language cohort. In the end, it was only about 3 or 4 people in the room who had English as a second language, or who were not perhaps as fluent. But it did create lots of challenges in terms of the community research approach, which we overcame largely in relational ways rather than formal solutions. That's not to say those were the best solutions by any means. The other thing was it wasn't just about language, it was about sociality. So it was about the ways in which Northern Irish people speak to each other in public spaces. And at some occasionally, the community researchers had to sort of quell the room to some degree, because it had fallen into what was quite a localized patter. So they really kind of kept an eye on that. So didn't solve those issues, but tried to find ways to mitigate for them, ameliorate them, and centralize people's meaning making in different ways. Where are we now? I think we have a question about critical AI literacy intervention. Yes. Is there somewhere in the framework this is included? Reema, you have some thoughts on critical AI literacy in your framework, don't you?
Yes, loads. I mean, it's kind of the answer to, it's not the answer, there's very rarely a single answer, by the way, but it's one of the parts of the answer to the challenge that it begins at the very beginning of, if we don't want this deficit model, what is it that we do want? And I think it is absolutely about that kind of sense of awareness and understanding of how everyday day-to-day life is being impacted in a rather disruptive way by AI technologies and tools. And we are beginning to see much more and more of it than when I began in the space, 5 years ago. So I'm not actually, I think that there's, a really live debate about things like copyright, about the role of AI and technology in the workforce. So these are examples of what I would sort of describe as critical thinking. I'm a bit ambivalent actually about the term literacy, because but literacy may be nuanced in a really sort of rich and deep sense as being about, like Paulo Freire, who's the educational theorist who's talking about literacy in this deep sense as dialogue-based literacy and awareness of rather than just simply being told what the answer is. It's actually a much more dynamic relationship of practical reflection upon one's relationship with AI tools and technologies in the world at large. I think he calls it praxis, but this sort of sense of actually critical thinking is about us reflecting on how AI tools and technologies are affecting us in our day-to-day lives, in our workspaces, as we go about interacting with each other. And part of the answer is that sort of notion of like our awareness of that catalyzes our sense of ability to change results and outcomes. Actually, it's got to start with the awareness. If we don't have a diagnosis of a problem, we're not going to have that sense of agency or power. Just to come back to that central word.
Just building on that, because it relates to the final point, which is the question: did the communities you work with have opinions on where to take it next, or what they wanted to tell the tech powers? Yes. And that actually relates a lot to kind of what critical AI literacy might do and what it's good for. And I think we had an example, just very short story of somebody who came to the community researchers after the engagement had taken place and said, look, I'm a nurse, and what I've taken from this is that I can have a role when these technologies are being applied. I'm starting to know what to look out for. I'm starting to know the questions to ask. I can take this into my working context and I can help make it right. And part of me, feels like there are some caveats to that sort of sense of empowerment, but I feel that in itself is kind of really illustrative of some of the directions this can go in and the necessity for this awareness to be fostered, and for people to make decisions, not just for themselves, but for what they think is right, for the good that they want to produce. And in terms of the wider what they wanted, we had an exercise called Speaking Truth to Power, and some of these in some of these research locations, and we're going to be focusing on them soon in the social media narration of this research. So you'll be able to read, and it wasn't just the things that they wanted to say to Elon Musk or to Bill Gates, or although these people got mentioned, they wanted, they said things to ministers, to the Home Office, to teachers. They said they wanted to talk to religious institutions about how they should behave with AI and all of those things. So they were really looking across society to think about the responsibilities, the shared responsibilities that come with the deployment of AI and its use. Right. Sorry, I just realised the time. It's 2 o'clock. Are we okay to go on, or are there strict rules, Reema, in terms of like further questions? And
I think, to be honest, I think there are strict rules, but I don't know whether Ruth, I don't think she's going to cut us off. So let's sort of answer this one. But obviously, if anyone needs to leave, they can leave. But I do think this is a good one to sort of explore, which is the definition of AI question, which came up quite a bit in this project. And it will be the final question, and then we'll close it.
I'm going to take a little bit of an opt-out and suggest to look deeply into the report in terms of the specific definition of AI, because we explored the various different definitions of AI and its potential capabilities, as well as specific tools that have been developed in different contexts. From a functionalities point of view. So we didn't give a definition of AI. We were sort of unpicking and challenging some core definitions that they might have heard of and might have thought about, whether AI is artificial, whether it's intelligent, and really pointing to the human and power relationships that are really built into AI infrastructure at all stages. But yes, it's more of that in the report.
And the framework, there is a bit which talks about AI definition being understood as being about how we use the term, so the kind of sociological way of thinking about it. It seems like it covers a lot of very kind of nebulous connected concepts or applications and use cases, and in a way it's probably a good decision not to define it too narrowly. Most definitions are really controversial. So huge thank you to everyone for their active listening and participation. Fantastic series of questions, really appreciated them. Pleasure to have you with us. Thank you, and take care.
Thank you very much.
Your day. Bye.
Bye.